All right, everyone, it's 1 o'clock on the final Wednesday of the Interdisciplinary Conservation Seminar series with the Human Environment Systems Group at Boise State. My name is Matt Williamson. I'm an assistant professor in Human Environment Systems, and I've been your host for the seminar series this semester. Just a few logistics before we get started. As you will know, if you've been here much this semester, the sessions are all being recorded. We'll be sending around the links via email. There's also a YouTube channel playlist where you can relive all of this semester's speakers. When you come in, you are muted. We also ask that you turn off your cameras to make sure that the presentation streams smoothly for all. We'll hold questions until the end, but you're welcome to post them in the chat as you have them. When we do get to the question and answer session, you can either raise your hand using the button in the participants list or just turn on your camera. That'll be how I know you have a question. This is our last seminar of the semester, so this web link won't have any more scheduled, but you will be able to go here to link to the YouTube channel if you happen to lose that link over time. Lastly, I just want to thank you all for being willing to join us all semester. It's certainly been a very long and difficult semester between racial violence continuing to be perpetrated by the police, fires burning up most of the Western United States and Canada, and an election season that we still don't actually have an official end to. We ask that you continue to be kind to each other and most especially to yourself, and maybe try to take some time over the coming break between semesters to rejuvenate. With that, we're extremely grateful to have Karen Bailey join us today for our final seminar. Karen is at University of Colorado Boulder and is interested in human environment interactions, climate change, and sustainable rural livelihoods. She's an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist and combines social science research with environmental and ecological data to understand feedbacks between communities and their environments, how we can build resilience to climate change, and how to support landscapes that meet human needs and sustainability goals. She also has an emphasis on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in environmental fields and STEM more broadly, and is committed to research that supports, amplifies, and engages the most vulnerable among us. Her current research projects focus on climate adaptation in Southern Africa, human health and well-being in East Africa, barriers to entry in natural resource fields, just and equitable climate change research, and urban communities and environmental engagement. We're really excited to have Karen join us today. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks everybody for being here. Gonna advance my slides. There we go. So the title of my talk today, which I think might have changed since initially sharing it, but Climate Change, Social Capital, and Sustainable Livelihoods in Conservation Landscapes. As I said, I'm assistant professor at the Environmental Studies program at CU Boulder. So just a quick outline of what I'll discuss today. First, I'll give an overview of kind of the global change context that I'm working within and its impacts on rural livelihoods. Then talk a bit explicitly about the conservation landscapes and climate adaptation, and some key findings and conclusions from 2 case studies and 2 particular projects that I'll share today. I'll then briefly discuss some of my ongoing and future research directions and my work surrounding diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So first, I'd like to start by thanking all the researchers, translators, funding sources, collaborative teams, community liaisons, etc., who have made this work possible. I've been lucky to work with lots of people in lots of places to do this research that I think is really important. So global change processes, in particular climate change and land use change, have significant impacts, as we all know, having watched much of our country burn this year, on every facet of life. Human well-being and survival are intrinsically linked to these global change processes, and it's really critical to understand how we impact change and how global change impacts us. My work tends to focus on climate change and in particular drought, and in some contexts flooding, but is broadly aimed at understanding how individuals, households, communities, and organizations perceive and respond to changing climates. And this is a slide that I include a version of in my Intro to Environmental Studies class because I think it really just highlights the extent, scale, and sort of intensity of global climate change, in particular drought, across the world. The impacts of climate change are especially pronounced when it comes to smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries. These household and communities and farmers disproportionately bear the burden of negative impacts from climate change and will continue to do so as it intensifies. When climate change impacts these communities, crops fail, livestock die en masse, and livelihoods are severely overturned. And the need to understand this relationship with global change is especially important, as I said, for these smallholder farming communities. And I just want to point out kind of the scope and scale of these communities and these livelihoods. Smallholder farms are those that typically support a single family with a mixture of cash crops and subsistence farming. And smallholders represent a significant proportion of the world's global population, with over 500 million farmers and 2 billion people relying on small holdings. This map shows the distribution of smallholder farms of different sizes and grazing land across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And as you can see, much of the global south is devoted to small-scale farming and grazing. And because these communities are reliant on rain-fed ag and natural resources, they're highly vulnerable to global change. I have I'm an environmental social scientist. That's sort of the term that I use these days, but all of my degrees have the word ecology in them. And so as someone who was trained as an ecologist, and I have a strong interest in conservation and sustainable livelihoods, I often work with these smallholder communities living in conservation landscapes. And that's a term that's generally quite vague, but generally I use it and others use it to mean a landscape that is identified as important for biodiversity conservation by some entity somewhere that may be threatened by global environmental and anthropogenic changes. These landscapes often have communities that are also heavily directly dependent on natural resources, along with the wildlife, for example, living there. And thus both humans and environmental and ecological processes are impacted by global changes in these landscapes. I'm currently working in 3 conservation landscapes. The first is the Maputoland Albany Biodiversity Hotspot. It's quite a mouthful, which include regions of South Africa, Mozambique, and eSwatini, formerly Swaziland. This region is known for incredibly high levels of plant endemism, including the highest tree diversity of any temperate forest in the world. The second, moving north, is the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, or KAZA. This region is most well known for its large elephant populations, and it's really critical for elephant conservation in Africa. And then the final conservation landscape that I work in is in East Africa, in the East Albertine Rift, or the East Afro-Montane Biodiversity Hotspot, and is really important for wildlife and conservation. In particular, there's a number of important bird species and also primate species in the region. And of course, across all of these landscapes, large populations of smallholder communities and people who are directly dependent on the environment. So within each of these contexts, much of my work is at the intersection of climate change, human-environment interactions, adaptation, and human health and well-being. My overall research motivation is to understand relationships between climate change, smallholder adaptation, well-being, and human-environment interactions, and its implications for social environmental systems and conservation landscapes. The title of my talk includes the term social capital. In my work, I often focus on the role and value of social networks and social resources to support sustainable natural resource use, resilience, and adaptation, and to really better understand the drivers of human-environment interactions. I tend to focus on social capital because we have seen and many others have observed the critical role that it can play in supporting resilience and often the risks associated with responding to climate change, particularly among global vulnerable communities. So I'll attempt to illustrate this link between climate change adaptation and social capital using a case study from eSwatini. Working with communities in eSwatini, again, formerly Swaziland, I don't Some people know that the name changed in 2018, but we were focused on understanding how climate change impacted their livelihoods and what some of the responses to these impacts were. So Eswatini is a small country in Southern Africa, home to many smallholders with more than 75% of the population depending on farming and natural resource-based livelihoods. The primary staple crop is maize, and incomes are relatively low, between $300 and $2,500 per year on average, at least the last time that we were collecting data. The average rainfall varies pretty significantly with this east to west gradient between 450 and 1,400 millimeters annually. So there's a lot of variation in terms of what crops can be grown, and also differences in how climate change and in particular drought are impacting communities across the country. And as I said before, Eswatini is in this first conservation landscape that I mentioned. And from my perspective, I think understanding, and from the perspective of many of the communities working and living in this region, understanding the nature of these human-environment interactions and what environmentally dependent households do when they're under threat in this really biodiverse landscape that's also really important for ecotourism is critical for understanding and protecting biodiversity along with sustainable livelihoods. So Eswatini is also experiencing significant and increasingly severe impacts from climate change, including one of the most severe droughts in recent memory. Between 2015 and 2016, rain fell to below 65% of average, and maize yields declined to less than half of average, as shown in this figure, where maize output declined from an average of around 80,000 tons to less than 40,000 tons. So really significant declines in terms of crop production. Associated with that, declines in water availability and grazing land also led to tens of thousands of cattle dying. And in the Southern African context and elsewhere, cattle are incredibly important, not just for the sort of livelihood associated outputs for raising and selling crops, but also incredibly culturally important. And so as a result of these declines in maize production and livestock loss, food prices rose pretty drastically, and many students and many children were forced to attend school just to have something to eat, as this headline shares. So I was in Eswatini in 2015 and 2016 and had the opportunity to understand how people were responding to this particular drought. To sort of understand responses to drought and to operationalize this response and this adaptation, I use the concept of adaptive capacity, which is the ability to effectively respond to or take advantage of change in changing environments. And to measure this, I borrow from the Sustainable Rural Livelihoods framework, which hypothesizes that adaptive capacity is driven by access to and quality of these 5 types of capital: physical, financial, natural, human, and social capital. And I'll just briefly run through what we think of each of these as sort of tangibly. Physical capital refers to access to local infrastructure, such as roads and hospitals, and household physical durable assets, things like buildings, tractors, and technology. Financial capital refers to household wealth and includes access to loans and startup capital and income from employment in small businesses. Social capital refers to the extent to which individuals are involved in local social networks. This can include unstructured social networks, such as communicating or trading with neighbors, or more structured social networks, such as working for or hiring neighbors or participating in community organizations. Natural capital encompasses the availability and quality of local natural areas and the resources they provide, such as farmland, grazing land, water, forests, and the livestock and wildlife that they support. And finally, human capital encompasses the skills, knowledge, and experience that people have, including education, employment, and training. And so the prevailing hypothesis is that increased availability of any type of capital improves overall adaptive capacity. However, it's less clear if and when one type of capital might be more important in increasing adaptive capacity than others. There's evidence that in some contexts, some types of capital might be more important. And really, if we want to look ahead into the future and support adaptation and resilient strategies for climate change, identifying if and how one type of capital might be more important than others is really critical to efficient intervention strategies. Oh, scroll up. So to investigate this, I combined some qualitative and quantitative social science methods to collect data. We conducted 18 focus groups in 6 communities in Eastern Swaziland that was experienced the drought most severely. And during each of these focus group, we worked with participants to gather data on relevant community histories and climate change, economic trends, what organizations are operating locally, what's the nature of community leadership, to get a sense of the context and the ways in which people might be able to respond given that context. We then generated a list of potential adaptation options that a household might enlist in response to drought and other climate stresses, including those that might have been used historically and some that are used today or possibly in the future. And then finally, use some participatory mapping exercises to get a sense of where people collect natural resources, what resources are available, and and really to understand how land use and land cover were changing and how this might be exacerbating or supporting adaptation to the current drought situation. We also wanted to get a sense of changes in populations, in migration, out-migration, and identify community boundaries. I then developed a quantitative household survey that conducted with around 300 households in each of our communities. And during each survey, we collected data on household demographics, the 5 types of capital, what adaptations a household attempted, and in particular, if they attempted that adaptation, was it successful in their perception in increasing either food consumption, income, or agricultural output. So based on the focus groups and preliminary research, we developed a suite of indicators for each type of capital that could be used quantitatively measured in and put into our statistical models. There's a lot here, so I'll just sort of zoom in on one type of capital as an example. With natural capital, we asked each household to quantify their most recent crop harvest in terms of kilograms, the amount of farmland they own, if they collect wild foods to eat or other natural resources, how often, how much, and how far they might travel, and the number of livestock owned. Because all of these variables are highly correlated, or at least we expected them to be, I did use ordination methods, principal components analysis, to condense the variables for use in the statistical models. So I've been talking sort of abstractly about adaptation. So I wanted to first give an overview of the types of adaptations most commonly used and how often they were considered successful. Most commonly, households modified existing farming strategies by planting drought or heat tolerant crops or cash crops, such as cotton, wheat, sorghum, legumes, sunflowers, or by engaging in conservation farming, which is aimed at maintaining soil moisture and quality and minimizing soil erosion. And these are strategies that have been used historically in response to declines in rainfall. So about 51% of households attempted, but the reported success rate for things like planting drought and heat resistant crops was only about 28%. So relatively low. Again, hopefully the figures I showed you before and the headlines gave you a sense that this is a more extreme and severe drought. And so some of the strategies that were successful in the past were less successful during this drought. There was also, households also went to search for salaried off-farm work, raising chickens to sell, selling crafts made locally, collecting and selling natural resources, participating in local organizations, and for a few households, keeping bees. So looking directly at the link between adaptation and capital, I found that adaptation is positively associated with capital diversity. That is the spread of a household's capital across the 5 different types of capital. This idealized data here just shows the difference between a diverse set of capital evenly spread across the 5 types and a non-diverse spread of capital with one type dominating. These regression results show a positive relationship such that as capital diversity on the x-axis there increases, so does the number of adaptations that a household attempted. So this was really interesting sort of first finding that households that were basically investing in different types of capital and a broader range of types of capital more evenly were able to attempt more adaptations. Among the different types of capital, surprise, surprise, social capital was most strongly correlated with adaptation attempts. So this graph shows standardized beta coefficients, which are an indicator of the strength of a particular variable on the outcome variable. Social capital has the largest non-zero coefficient, indicating the strongest relationship. Households with high levels of social capital were more likely to report attempting adaptations and often having more successful adaptations. Natural capital was also positively associated with adaptation, although relationship wasn't quite as strong across households. And again, the nature of the drought is likely associated with that. Human and financial capital are surprisingly negative in this data set and non-statistically significant as well. And it's worth noting that there's just a lot of variation in access to financial resources and human resources. And so that's likely why a lot of that variation shows up. We also, I found sort of this really interesting additional finding was that structured social capital, in particular, working for or hiring neighbors, and again, that was sort of accounting for whatever additional income or loss of income might be associated with working for or hiring someone, and participating in community groups was positively correlated with the probability of having a successful adaptation. So again, that's some increase in food income or agricultural output. So this figure shows an index of structured social capital specifically, and its correlation with adaptation success. So households that had more access to that structured social capital were more likely to report that their adaptation was successful. And so what I can conclude from this work is that social capital is potentially really critical. Structured social capital in particular establishes and strengthens pathways and exchange of information, opportunities, and other types of capital. So it supports both access to novel adaptations and also the additional types of capital that might be necessary to engage in those adaptations. It takes households beyond knowing and communicating with each other and provides a stable safety net potentially in times of stress. Increasing this structured social capital is critical to enabling future adaptation to climate change. This could include creating and devoting more resources to community organizations and searching for new opportunities to bridge and link households and communities in structured ways. I thought that this was exciting news for those working to understand and support climate adaptation. Communities in eSwatini and in similar rural areas in low and middle income countries are often rich in social capital and have great potential to grow and strengthen that structured social capital. Strong networks already exist between neighbors, church groups, schools that can be tapped into to help communities as climate changes. And while this wasn't an explicit focus of this particular piece of the work, I do think it's worth noting that communities with stronger social networks were less likely to report degradation and fragmentation of the surrounding savanna landscape, and were more confident in the sustainability of their livelihoods and the natural resources on which they depend. They tended to express a greater appreciation for local wildlife and their potential for improving their livelihoods. Just keeping an eye on the time here. Okay, gonna shift gears a bit and talk about a different project in East Africa. And really, after gaining some interesting insights and data related to climate adaptation and social capital, I wanted to learn more about the ways in which social networks support both human livelihoods and potentially broader conservation goals. So this next case study is from Uganda and the Albertine Rip, and specifically around Bwindi Impenetrable National Forests, shown here. Bwindi is well known for being one of the last remaining homes on the mountain gorilla, and the region is really important for wildlife conservation as a result. So the region surrounding Windy is also really important for sustainable rural livelihoods. In the past few decades, there's been an increase in local populations surrounding the park, leading to really high population densities directly adjacent to the park boundary, in part because there are really fertile volcanic soils in this East Albertine Rift region. This increase in population has led to increased pressure on the landscape and concerns surrounding food security and potential illegal resource extraction within the park. A key consideration in the region is this tension between the needs of local communities and conservation goals. Historically, communities living in the region had been highly dependent on forest resources, including timber, firewood, medicinal plants, forest wildlife. And when the park became established, and as the landscape continued to be changed, many lost access to the natural forests of the region. In response to the need for forest products and wood products in particular, and in response to changing sort of broader economic markets, there's been an increase in planting trees outside of the protected area. So the plots of these trees, often called woodlots, and that's how I'll refer to them from here on, represent an important adaptation strategy for changing livelihoods and environmental conditions. And so that's what this image is showing here. Basically all the trees that are on that hillside there are planted, either eucalyptus or pine trees that have been planted outside of the park. They also represent a potential strategy for minimizing pressure on Windy National Park. So where does social capital come in? In Windy, there are these interesting and really critically important local social organizations known as stretcher groups or stretcher societies, Ebibi Ibina Baingozi or Abataka in the local languages. These stretcher groups were first formed due to the steep terrain of the region and limited access to medical care. So I'm trying to show you, I hope you can tell, it's very steep there. They're hillside communities and they are hard to get up and down, I can attest to. Because the terrain is so steep and because it's often quite rainy throughout the year, the stretcher groups have emerged as a way of transporting the sick and the infirm and the deceased from homes to hospitals or for funerals, hence the term stretcher. For most households in this region, membership in stretcher groups is assumed and it involves paying dues and attending meetings of some kind. Stretcher groups, which formed out of a clear necessity of the environment really, have evolved to be incredibly important for local governance and conflict management and arbitration. So these stretcher groups not only sort of serve the broader purpose of moving people where they need to go when they're sick, but also are local organizations and social networks and social resources that have become important over time. Stretcher groups also own woodlots. So woodlots can be privately owned and they can be owned by stretcher groups. And so these really important social organizations that operate locally and maintain woodlots have led to this potentially interesting research question. And given the context of forest-dependent communities living in a biodiversity hotspot and stretcher groups as an important local institution, we want to ask the question, how does access to woodlots support local livelihoods? And are there differences in access to privately owned and stretcher group owned woodlots? So working in 12 communities outside of Windy, we conducted focus groups and household surveys to understand demographics, livelihood strategies, forest product needs, what did people previously need in terms of forest or wood products, and what do people need now? Where are folks sourcing these wood products from? How are people engaging in with stretcher groups? And then what are the nature of the woodlots themselves? The main resource that households are using woodlots for are building materials like timber and poles and energy such as firewood and charcoal. These products support both daily on-farm activities, like cooking, for example, and off-farm economic strategies, selling timber and selling poles beyond the community. Other includes plants used for medicinal plants and things used for other than building and energy. We also asked households the sort of broader question, are you able to meet your household's wood product needs? given what you need to use each day, each month, each week, each year, are you able to access them given what you have access to? And the good news is about 70% of households say that they are able to meet their wood product needs, but 30% are not. When we looked at the role of stretcher groups in the region, we found that while most households are involved in stretcher groups, 98% of households are involved, and that 70% of stretcher groups own woodlots, most households source their daily wood products from private woodlots rather than these stretcher group owned woodlots. So despite the fact that households are pretty much universally involved in stretcher groups and many stretcher groups own woodlots, they are not necessarily getting what the wood products that they need on a day-to-day basis from stretcher group owned woodlots. And that's because stretcher group owned woodlots serve needs related to their founding. Stretcher group owned woodlots serve broader community needs, such as selling timber to pay for emergencies, using the timber to construct coffins, or building community structures. So they're linked to this broader role as a social organization that serves the community. And so not necessarily things that households rely on the day-to-day, but things that are valuable during certain times, for instance, during emergencies. And accordingly, since daily household wood needs were not generally sourced from stretcher group owned woodlots, we found that having access to a stretcher group owned woodlot was not really important in meeting household wood needs. So this figure shows in blue, households that have access to private woodlots, and in orange, households that have access to stretcher group woodlots and private woodlots. And basically you see there's no difference in terms of the number that report being able to meet their wood product needs and not being able to meet their wood product needs. If you have access to a private woodlot, you're probably going to be able to meet your wood product needs. Conversely, this figure shows in blue households that have access to stretcher group woodlots only, and households that don't have any kind of woodlot access. And again, almost the same in terms of who's able to have their household wood needs met, and those who are unable to meet their household wood needs. So basically having access to a stretcher group owned woodlot is not necessarily supporting those individual household needs. So despite this finding that stretcher group owned woodlots don't necessarily support daily wood product needs and might not necessarily be directly relevant in terms of household activity and individual household well-being, we did find that other important roles that stretcher groups can play, and particularly these stretcher group owned woodlots. Households are able to get experience managing woodlots and support for private woodlot management. So when you're involved in a stretcher group, you have duties associated with managing that woodlot, which prepares you to own your own potentially someday and provides resources, knowledge, skills, and sometimes capital in order to do that. It also, as I said, it provides a broader social network that supports livelihood activities. Again, most households are involved in these stretcher groups, and so it provides access to information, to opportunity, to other types of resources that support livelihood activities. Also really important, natural resource conflict mediation. Households are sourcing the wood products that they need from their own private woodlots and potentially the private woodlots of other people they know. So sometimes there's conflict over natural resources, and stretcher groups play the important role of arbiter or mediator when these conflicts arise. Also, a really important resource during times of stress. These woodlots and these stretcher group owned woodlots are resources on which the community can depend when there is a significant impact that limits the access to food, that might be associated with significant climate impact that households can rely on as a community. And additionally, collective governance to negotiate beyond the community. So, and to strengthen relationships with the national park. So again, I mentioned there's this tension between the needs of the communities surrounding Bwindi and the sustainability and conservation goals within the national park. And the stretcher groups serve as a governing body kind of below the local chairman to advocate on behalf of these communities to the national park. So thinking about these two case studies and my research as a whole, I show that there's some important and nuanced links linked between climate change, human well-being, adaptation, and social capital. Particularly, the first case study showed that household access to capital, and in particular social capital, can support adaptation behavior during times of acute climate stress. Social networks, while important, don't necessarily provide all of the necessary livelihood resources, as shown in the second case study in Wendy. And more broadly, and as I'm moving forward in my research, it's important to bear in mind that meeting both conservation goals and human needs in conservation landscapes requires consideration of these complex human environment interactions and some of the links to social capital as mediators and supporters of human environment interactions that are beneficial for both humans and the environment. Okay, checking on time here. Doing all right. So shifting gears a bit, I wanted to chat briefly about some of my work related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. In part because I'm actively seeking to broaden collaborators in this work, and because it broadly links to this idea of social capital and the value of human networks engaged in science. And also because, more so than ever, people are interested in hearing about this work. So one particular direction is aimed at better understanding some of the manifestations of structural racism in STEM fields. This headline is from a column in Nature that was published recently by a colleague of mine that highlights kind of one of the seemingly benign ways structures differentially impact some of us and not others. For instance, if you only have one name. So the impacts of structural racism take many forms, leading to underrepresentation, uneven power dynamics, cultural taxation, burdens of service. But one that's perhaps harder for folks to grasp who haven't experienced it directly is the extreme level of isolation that it accompanies it. As an ecologist and environmental scientist, I often find myself the only Black person in the room and often the only person of color in the room. So this figure highlights some of the trends in terms of doctoral degrees awarded in STEM over a 15-year period. You can see why the sort of trend in isolation is what my experience has been. Focusing a bit more on environmental fields and beyond academia, there's been a lot of research done on what's been termed the green ceiling. Much of this work has been done by Dorcita Taylor at Michigan, who found that despite decades of promises to diversify the conservation and environmental movements, efforts are falling short. There are many causes. She's often identified unconscious bias, discrimination, and insular recruiting, particularly as it relates to NGOs, government agencies, and foundations. And so this figure here shows the kind of proportions of people of color across different levels in the organizational hierarchies. And you can see that while a lot of effort has been made to increase diversity and inclusion in these spaces, much of it is happening in the early career stage. But it goes sort of well beyond the challenge of getting people into these fields. Once we're here, the spaces can often feel unsafe and unwelcoming. I'm currently doing research with environmental scientists and conservationists of color to learn more about their experiences. And here's a quote from a recent article we published about a student's experience conducting ecological field research. The word was only said once, but it echoed in her ears. She heard stories of the word thrown at others, including her parents, but the word was never used towards her. The N-word. It felt like a punch to the gut. She looked around at her peers and saw blank faces. She immediately began to question her decisions regarding work. Is this my new normal? Can I survive the field season when so much pain was inflicted on the first day? She thought back to her childhood, watching Steve Irwin on television, with an infectious smile and bright optimism. She dreamt of being like him, traversing the outdoors to see all of the wondrous animals. Yet Steve Irwin did not look like her, nor did her peers. In addition to often being the only one, we're treated like it in some cases. Many people of color I know and work with have experienced overt explicit racism and microaggressions simply because they existed while doing their science. This was an incident that happened out east, but to bring it home to where sort of I am and you are, the outdoors and science in the outdoors doesn't always feel safe. Coloradans and a lot of people in the Western US have really meaningful relationships with their environment and such a commitment to it that it's really exciting to come here and to be here and do environmental research. But cultural norms often make the space unwelcoming. Many young environmentalists of color have shared with me their experiences of being judged for not having the right gear to be considered legit. Another Black woman who's also a Muslim shared with me how she was made fun of and othered for wanting to maintain a level of hygiene that was seen as not outdoorsy enough. Among many out West, there's a narrow view of what a relationship with the environment means, and that makes it hard for those who don't fit that view to enter this workforce. What we're finding, though, through this research is that many people of color have similar experiences to those that I've just described. Maybe they're not called a racial slur, though many are, but maybe it's presumed that they were only hired because of their race, or that they don't have the same skills or capacity as their peers, or that they don't fit the norm of what an environmentalist should or could be. And we're finding that often one of two things seems to happen. Either they leave the field and go somewhere where they aren't seen as the only one and where they won't be seen in a way that makes them feel excluded, or they stay and try to fix it and feel an overwhelming burden to fix things, to take on the task of making the experiences for those that come after them better. Some of the people we've spoken to have described feeling like a martyr for the cause of equity in STEM. And because of that overwhelming compulsion to fix things and the associated mental and emotional labor, it can be overwhelming and it can detract from our ability to do the science that first attracted us to the field. A lot of research suggests that faculty of color achieve tenure at lower rates than white faculty, in part because of this extra need to fix things. I've been working with a group of researchers in environmental studies here at CU Boulder to gather data from the University of Colorado system to examine the rates of tenure among faculty and to see if there's a disproportionate service burden might explain any differences. The good news is, at this sort of preliminary stage of this research, it doesn't seem that there's an impact associated with race. The bad news is that there does seem to be a correlation with gender, with women less likely to achieve tenure in our sample and to be more likely to spend time on service activities rather than research activities. So this trend provides an important opportunity to highlight the fact that oppressive structures that limit any one group limit us all. I often quote the feminist scholar and critical theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, who first coined the term intersectionality by saying, "When they enter, we all enter. When we make spaces equitable and inclusive for the most marginalized and oppressed amongst us, we all benefit." I think I might be running out of time. Yeah, I'll wrap up soon. So what can we do and how can we move forward? Okay, yeah. In the context of structural racism in STEM, my sort of soapbox is one of bringing our humanity back into our science. When I say humanity, I mean ourselves, our identities, and our values. A recent study found that Black scientists were 20% less likely to receive funding from the National Institutes of Health and than white scientists, and that this gap is largely explained by the types of research questions pursued. Black scientists were more likely to propose research focused on people, communities, and populations rather than pathogens and purely biological processes. Seeing humanity in their research, Black scientists sought to understand health disparities, patient-focused interventions, and challenges for adolescent healthcare, for example. And consistently, review panels viewed such research as less impactful and less worthy of funding, leading to this disparity in NIH funding. And so this figure here is just sort of a word cloud of some of the distinction between these groups. And this bias towards impactful, quote unquote, research that lacks humanity and ignores the social, political, and economic processes that influence health, influence the way that we teach science and how science is viewed more broadly. As a result, people might be less likely to be represented in textbooks and widely shared research articles. it means that budding scientists are unlikely to see themselves and their communities when they learn about science. For me, this manifested as growing up wanting to be an ecologist and to understand the environment, but rarely seeing myself and my communities and my environments represented in ecology. I obtained 2 degrees, as I said, with the word ecology in them before learning that people and the environment meant more to me than just the environment. So I was able to sort of make this shift. I started my ecology dissertation studying small mammals and spent 5 months doing an entirely small mammal focused research project, and then had a crisis of faith and decided I needed to study people. So those are pictures of me from the field in eSwatini in both contexts. But for so long, my learning had focused on ecology in such a way that I was unable to see myself, my communities, and the social processes that played a critical role in our understanding of the environment. So to me, infusing humanity into our science means normalizing and valuing the role of our identity and our lived experiences in our science, so that future scientists can embody their work, they can feel more included in STEM, and they conduct research that changes the world from both an environmental and social context. My research is finding again and again that people of color have challenges entering and persisting in STEM, generally, and in environmental fields specifically. To combat this, I consistently bring humanity into my work and acknowledge the overt processes that have led to the current state of affairs that we're in. This can take many forms. For instance, in my lecture for my Intro to Environmental Studies class recently, before discussing a new statistical test, chi-squared, we discussed its history and taught students how it was actively used by early statisticians to promote racist ideals and Nazi propaganda. The point wasn't necessarily don't use the statistical test. The point was, think about how science has been used to oppress people in the past and how it may continue to do so, and acknowledge and mitigate your bias when doing science. So as I move forward in my research, I'm working on understanding the interactions between all of these things: history, society, identity, impacts, and how it influences science, and particularly the success of individuals in STEM. So I will pause there and open it up. I think I'm okay for time. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm trying to turn on my gallery view so I can see other people. Just a reminder, if you have a question, you can raise your hand by pushing the little button in your participant list, or just turn on your camera. Then I can see your face and know that you have a question. While folks are thinking about questions, I guess sort of torn. On the one hand, I want to know a little bit more about, I guess, continuing on this topic that you were just wrapping up with, and thinking about sort of the discussions we've been having here inside HES and around Boise State, where we don't have as diverse a faculty as we might, trying to figure out what our roles are and sort of supporting these ideas and creating welcoming spaces, even when there aren't necessarily people here currently to enjoy those spaces. And I wonder if in the course of your research, you've seen examples of what that looks like when it's effective, and examples of what that might look like when maybe it's misguided.
Yeah, the misguided might be easier to respond to, because I think it's happened more often. Certainly that the tokenizing, overburdening social taxation piece, where folks who are underrepresented, and again, this particular work is focused on structural racism, but I am very interdisciplinary and intersectional in my approach. So I am thinking about intersections with sexual identity and orientation, right? I'm thinking about ability and disability. I'm thinking about sort of all the ways in which one could be underrepresented, and there are many. But definitely the kind of bring one person in and ask them to do all the work to make it better for folks who might come after strategy. and that's not always done. It's actually rarely done intentionally, but one thing that's really important is to make invisible work visible and to reward that and recognize that. So knowing that certain underrepresented folks with underrepresented backgrounds might be more often approached to be on committees or to serve as faculty advisors to student groups, right? Or to write more letters of recommendations. All of these things might not show up, for instance, in like an annual sort of reporting of what I did this year, but maybe there are ways that a department can think about how they're measuring that to make it more visible and more rewarded. The other thing is to kind of share the work. I'm so proud of the department that I'm currently in. Obviously, lots of problems. I'm the first person of color hired into a tenure track position in the department's 25-year history. But this summer, rather, they had a sort of reckoning with that, and largely led by the graduate student population in response to the murder of George Floyd. Our sort of inclusive excellence, formerly inclusive excellence, now JEDI action group went from 8 people, almost entirely faculty, to now over 45 people, faculty, staff, students, graduate and undergraduate students, right? So figuring out how a broader community can be engaged effectively to work on issues as it relates to hiring and retention of staff and faculty, as it relates to inclusive culture for graduate and undergraduate students, as it relates to JEDI in the curriculum, bringing in more people to do the work and to really integrate JEDI principles and JEDI goals into every aspect of the work that the department or the unit does.
I just want to make sure I'm not missing other people's questions. Look up, Jamie has turned on her camera.
Hi, thanks so much, Dr. Bailey. I appreciated all of the different things that you covered there. And look forward to maybe chatting more. One question that came up, I am doing work kind of at the intersection of multiple borders, so US, Canada, tribal, non-tribal land. And I actually spent a couple months in South Africa near the border of Mozambique. And I was wondering if in this research, if there is any impact on specifically social capital around different borders, and whether it's South Africa to Mozambique, or thinking of like fortress conservation in the area where you've got multiple national parks that people can't kind of go into necessarily.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And borders are complex in the way that they influence how we access and use and manage natural resources, but certainly how we move across them, and who can access and who can be accessed from the context of social capital. The communities that I was working in the particular work that I shared here from eSwatini, are very much linked to Mozambique and South Africa. When I mentioned that lots of households go to look for off-farm work, they are usually doing that either in large-scale sugar plantations that are nearby, going to the capital city of Eswatini, or they're going to Mozambique and South Africa, right? That's where they're more likely to find at least certain types of work. So there is definitely this spatial and temporal component to who your social network is and how you're linked to them across these borders. And ultimately, given that they're relatively open borders, they don't pose as much of a boundary. That is the sort of geopolitical borders between the countries don't pose as much of a boundary as do like the fence around Kruger National Park. So yeah, I get the simple answer is there's lots of social connections and lots of transfer of social capital, and through that other types of capital between communities in those 3 countries. The fortress conservation piece is a really important boundary question, and has problems both from a conservation perspective, as you think of the rising elephant populations in Kruger National Park and whether or not we should be culling them, and the communities outside of Kruger that are unable to access resources, for example. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it's a really interesting topic. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks for the question.
Lauren, I can see your face now.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for sharing your research and your journey. That was really interesting and inspiring to hear. And I have two questions. I'm interested in how I'm interested generally in supporting the incorporation of more history and the role and present roles of institutions in continuing racism in our programs and in STEM more generally, but just focusing on our department so we can sort of shift now. What was the process of incorporating more of that material into your curriculum, and was it supported by the department entirely? Was that like an initiative that was formed by the group that you mentioned, or how did that work? And then my other question was about your research and the additional social cost or stigma that might be associated with having only a structure rather than a private land parcel, rather than just being resource-based. Was there like a social element to having your own private versus just being part of a structure group? So I don't know what order you want to answer those, but I'd be happy to clarify.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the first question, my strategy has been to sort of first, with all of my teaching, right, is broader unit level, course level learning outcomes, attempting to align with those as best as possible and making sure whatever foundational concepts are being taught, and then bringing in case studies that are often directly related to some of these broader issues of JEDI, of racism, of oppression, of marginalization, of the structures that sort of support those processes and continue to exist, and sort of willfully or not support those processes. So and in general, there hasn't been pushback to incorporating that into my courses. And I guess I'd push back on the pushback if there were, because I think there's nothing to preclude teaching the science along with teaching everything that is related to the formation, dissemination, creation of the science and how we're learning from it, which is related to all of these structures that have historically benefited from extractive, oppressive practices. So yeah, I guess my strategy has been make sure I'm teaching kind of what foundationally needs to be taught, but teaching it in a way that's sensitive to and intersecting with some of these broader JEDI issues. To this, oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering if you're being recognized for that extra work that you're doing for changing your classroom curricula to incorporate all of that.
No, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I think a lot of people are starting to do it more now. And for me, I guess that's the other thing. For a lot of people, how can I phrase this? I feel like I have to, in part because it's my lived experience. It's harder for me to leave it out. So it maybe doesn't necessarily feel like it's as much work to bring it in. I guess that's the simplest way to say it. In terms of the second question, which now I think I've lost track of.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was an additional social cost or like a stigma that was associated with only having.
So I would say in general, there's not, so most people want to own private woodlots if they have the land or have access to the land or are able to. There is some interesting, there are different ethnic groups in the region, and we did find some distinctions in terms of the proportion of households from the different ethnic groups that have access to it. And that also is related to the lengthy and complex histories of in-migration, out-migration, and conflict over natural resources. Yeah, most people are affiliated with a stretcher group and a stretcher group owned woodlot. Most people have or at least many people have a broader goal of wanting to own trees. And trees are now seen as like a bank resource. And so there's limitations financially and in terms of land ownership. And then there's also this ethnic cultural distinction, but not necessarily a stigma per se.
So there are a few questions in the chat and we probably won't have time to get to all of them. So what we don't get to, I will put into the Slack channel and we can sort of deal with over the course. But before we sign off, Peter asked a question. Basically, your work sort of highlights the importance of social capital. And the question is, what do you see as being the main ways to increase or build social capital over the long term? And I guess I'll ask the sort of converse of that, which is, how do we prevent eroding social capital in the places where it already exists?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I do think it's important to note that social capital is important, especially important kind of everywhere globally. Social networks are incredibly important. Here in the US, it's how we might get a job, right? It's how we might meet our spouse, right? But here in the US, social networks are not what we should necessarily be relying on to feed ourselves, right? They play a slightly different role here, a little bit superfluous to survival. In the context where I've been working, social networks and social capital are much more critical to survival, in part because there are fewer government level structures and infrastructures that can support those social safety nets. So I think that's just sort of important to acknowledge. In terms of supporting it, I think maybe related to that is ensuring that as those government structures become more available, they are sensitive to local needs and don't necessarily have a top-down oppressive structure to them that erode the existing social capital, right? So it's not providing resources in a way that communities might be seen as in conflict or in competition for resources. And then I also think it's building structure and capacity and trust and bridging and linking communities to, for instance, manage natural resources in a way that's equitable. Again, minimizing the potential for conflict and not potentially eroding that social trust there. Yeah, I guess that's what comes to mind in terms of, as we think about the process of development, which many of these countries are going through. There's a lot of potential for NGOs, for development agencies, for governments to set up structures that erode the social networks that already exist by limiting the capacity to actually have collective action. And so I think maintaining that ability to collectively manage resources, to collectively own and operate things, to bring resources together for shared wealth, I think is a way to minimize that erosion. But it's not something I've thought through.
I think that's a pretty interesting place to start that thought. We are after 2, so I just want to thank Dr. Bailey again for spending her time with us today. For the questions we didn't get to, it looks like those are both from folks who are registered for the seminar, so I'll just move those over to the Slack channel and you guys can sort of chat about it over time. For those of you who have meetings set up with Dr. Bailey, I think Kelly is coordinating those things. If you didn't get on that schedule and you would like to, you may have to piggyback on with some of your colleagues. But thanks for joining us this semester. Have a good rest of your day. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.